Racism is a global issue that affects millions of people worldwide, and unfortunately, Indians are no exception. Whether it's subtle microaggressions or overt acts of discrimination, the reality is that Indians often face racial prejudice in many parts of the world. In this video, we'll be exploring the top 10 countries where Indians face racism in 2024. I bet there's a copy of the ratio of 1.3 to 1.25, where Indians face racism in 2024. From the United States to Australia, the UK to the Middle East, we'll dive into how these prejudices manifest in different regions and the ongoing efforts to fight racism and promote equality. So, stay tuned as we take a closer look at the countries where Indian immigrants, students, and professionals continue to encounter racial bias and the barriers they face in their daily lives. 10. Italy. In Italy, racism against Indian migrants is often linked to broader anti-immigrant sentiments. Many Indians live in economically disadvantaged areas or work in low-status jobs, and they face both institutional and social discrimination. Italians have long had a difficult relationship with non-European immigrants, and Indians, particularly those from rural areas, are often subject to prejudice and exclusion. The perception of Indians as permanent outsiders is prevalent, and many report being the victims of racist jokes, verbal abuse, or even physical violence. Indians in Italy, particularly in smaller towns or rural areas, sometimes find themselves segregated from the local community. Although Italy is home to a small but growing Indian diaspora, it remains a challenging environment for many who face the dual struggles of economic hardship and racial discrimination. 9. Germany. Germany, known for its strong economy and open borders, still struggles with racial issues, particularly when it comes to its treatment of migrants from non-European countries. Indians, though not the largest immigrant group, have faced prejudice and discrimination, especially in the workplace and in education. In recent years, there has been a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment fueled by political movements, which has contributed to a more hostile environment for non-European immigrants. Indians in Germany report experiencing racial profiling and being subjected to derogatory stereotypes about their culture and work ethic. The rise of far-right movements in the country has also led to an uptick in incidents targeting people of Indian descent, with some reporting physical attacks or verbal abuse. Despite these challenges, the Indian community in Germany remains resilient, contributing significantly to the economy, especially in sectors like technology and academia. 8. UAE. The UAE has a large Indian expatriate population, many of whom work in construction, hospitality, and other low-wage sectors. While the UAE is known for its modern, cosmopolitan image, many Indian workers face exploitation, poor working conditions, and racial discrimination, particularly in the labor market. Indian workers are often confined to segregated housing and can face difficulties accessing healthcare and other public services. The kafala system, which controls the rights of foreign workers, has been a source of abuse, with some employers confiscating passports and making workers vulnerable to exploitation. Though many Indian nationals enjoy relative success in white-collar jobs and business ventures, they still encounter prejudice in social settings and in the workplace, where South Asians are often expected to take lower stellar roles. 7. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a large number of Indian expatriates, many of whom work in construction, domestic labor, and other low-paying jobs. While the kingdom has long been a destination for Indian workers, the treatment of these workers can often reflect deep-seated racial hierarchies. Indian laborers, along with other South Asians, often face poor living conditions, low wages, and mistreatment from employers. These issues are compounded by the country's kafala sponsorship system, which can leave workers vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Indians are frequently seen as second-class citizens in the eyes of the local population, with racial discrimination manifesting in housing, workplace settings, and daily life. Though there have been efforts, by the Indian government to ensure the protection of Indian nationals abroad, the system in Saudi Arabia perpetuates a degree of racial inequality that many Indian workers find hard to escape. 6. South Africa. South Africa has a unique racial history with its apartheid system that left deep scars in terms of racial relations. Indians, especially those of South Asian descent, have often faced racial discrimination due to their history in the country as indentured laborers. Though they form a significant part of the South African population, many Indians experience prejudice and exclusion from the larger Black African population, which sometimes views them as complicit in the legacy of apartheid. Racial tension has surfaced in the form of attacks on Indian-owned businesses and discrimination in employment. While the government has implemented affirmative action policies to address racial inequality, there are still significant challenges in achieving true racial harmony. Many Indians, particularly in areas like KwaZulu-Natal, feel caught between two worlds: the legacy of apartheid that marginalized them and the post-apartheid reality that still struggles with economic and racial disparities. Efforts to combat racism have been made, but tensions remain, particularly in economically disadvantaged areas. 5. Russia. In Russia, racism toward people of Asian descent, including Indians, is often coupled with xenophobia toward non-Slavic ethnic groups. Indians in Russia are often seen as outsiders and frequently face discrimination in the form of verbal abuse and racial violence. The media often perpetuates negative stereotypes of Indians as being involved in criminal activity or working in low-status jobs, which can lead to social exclusion. In larger cities like Moscow, where many Indians work in small businesses or as laborers, the discrimination can be more blatant, with Indians targeted for their accents, skin color, and cultural differences. Instances of violent attacks against Indian students and workers are not uncommon. Despite these challenges, many Indian immigrants continue to thrive in Russia, especially in the growing Indian business community, which has cultivated cultural and economic ties between the two countries. However, the ongoing issue of racism remains a significant hurdle for integration. 4. Canada. Canada is widely celebrated for its diversity and progressive stance on multiculturalism. However, Indians, particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, still experience racial discrimination in various aspects of their lives. Many newcomers report feeling marginalized or invisible, particularly in terms of employment and housing. Indian Canadians have long faced stereotyping in both model minority or perceived as threats in times of political unrest. The rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric, particularly during election cycles, has further fueled the perception that Indian immigrants are outsiders. Furthermore, Indian immigrants in Canada, like those in other countries, frequently experience microaggressions in social settings or workplace discrimination that limits their career progression. Despite this, Indian Canadians have made significant strides in overcoming these barriers, with a robust presence in politics, business, and cultural life. Organizations like the Canadian Council of South Asian Organization, CCSAO, have been working toward fostering a more inclusive society by advocating for policies that address systemic racism and economic inequality. 3. UK. In the United Kingdom, Indians have been integral to the nation's history, contributing significantly to its economy and culture. However, many Indian immigrants face subtle and overt forms of racism. Discrimination in housing, employment, and education is prevalent, with many Indians being subjected to microaggressions and racial profiling. South Asian communities, particularly those from India, often experience the effects of white British cultural dominance, which can manifest in exclusion from social activities or job opportunities. High-profile incidents, such as the 2017 terror attacks in Manchester and London, have seen some members of the Indian community wrongly associated with these events, heightening feelings of insecurity and suspicion. Although racism in the UK is not as overt as in other countries, these issues are often exacerbated by class divisions and the economic inequalities faced by the Indian diaspora. While significant efforts have been made by the Indian community and civil rights organizations to challenge these disparities, such as through educational campaigns and media advocacy, racism remains a persistent issue for many. 2. Australia. Australia has a complicated history with race, and Indian immigrants, particularly students and temporary workers, have been the target of racial discrimination and violence in recent years. Many Indian students reported experiencing racist attacks while studying, especially in Melbourne, which saw a surge in racially motivated assaults in the late 2000s. Indians are often stereotyped as outsiders, and some feel marginalized in their communities. This marginalization extends to social exclusion and discrimination in public spaces, such as transport or businesses. The public perception of Indians has often been shaped by media portrayals that highlight negative aspects of immigration, feeding into a broader anti-immigrant sentiment. Despite these challenges, Indian Australians have contributed significantly to the nation's economy and cultural landscape. Advocacy groups, including the Indian Student Association, have been working to combat this racism, pushing for policies that promote inclusion and tackle racial inequality. 1. USA. In the United States, Indians, especially immigrants and their descendants, have long faced racial discrimination, with incidents often centered around stereotyping and xenophobia. Despite being one of the most successful immigrant groups, reports of racial profiling, hate crimes, and challenges in the workplace persist. Indians are frequently stereotyped as perpetual foreigners. Regardless of how long they have lived in the U.S., attacks on Indian American individuals, especially in certain states, have been widely reported in recent years. A prominent example of this is the 2017 Kansas shooting, where an Indian engineer was killed by a gunman who mistook him for a Middle Eastern person. While these cases are not widespread, they reflect underlying prejudices that can often surface in polarized political climates. Moreover, systemic racism in employment and education continues to create barriers for many Indians trying to assimilate into American society. However, Indian Americans have shown resilience, becoming active in advocacy and policy reform to address issues like racial discrimination, equal employment, and hate crime legislation.